Hi, I'm Henry Farrell. I'm a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. And what I want to talk to you about today is the collision between coronavirus and the globalized economy. And here I want to build upon work that Abraham Newman at Georgetown University and I have been doing, where we have been looking at what we call weaponized interdependence. Weaponized interdependence refers to the ways in which states can take the structures and the networks that hold the globalized economy together and turn them into tools and weapons, effectively use them against other states in order to try and influence who gets what, use them as tools of coercion and manipulation. And this turns out to have some unexpected value in understanding what is happening in the current politics of coronavirus, because we are seeing a situation in which states are finding that they do not have access to the critical medical supplies that they need in order to fight coronavirus. They're finding that they don't have access to medical gloves, medical masks, respirators, agents needed for test kits. All of these things are suddenly in short supply. And this tells us important things about globalization, because globalized markets were supposed to provide a kind of security and efficiency against this kind of situation, but instead we find ourselves in a world in which apparently dull and mundane sounding things such as global supply chains are becoming effectively the subject of contention between different states. States are fighting each other in order to try and get access to the relevant supplies. They are trying to hoard supplies when they have them. Also, some states, in particular China, now that it is over its coronavirus shock, at least for the moment, is using the fact that it has excess supplies, using this as a kind of means of trying to gain advantage through what might be called competitive generosity. So in other words, we find ourselves in a world where the coronavirus pandemic is posing a massive stress test to globalization and is revealing all of these competitive dynamics. And what I want to do in this lecture is to talk through how this has happened, to give you some sense of the underlying logic, and to explain to you how coronavirus is leading to all of these stresses and strains on supply chains, and how in turn we are seeing new forms of competitive dynamics arising between states. In order to understand this, the best place to start is to think in a systematic way about what globalization actually involves. And maybe the best and simplest way to define globalization, which is of course a word which has many different definitions, is to focus on the role of global flows of people, goods, money, and information. So in the pre-globalized world, you saw movement of all of these things across borders, but you saw this happening at a relatively sedate pace. If you wanted to travel from one country to another, it probably cost quite a lot of money to do that back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. If you wanted to transport goods, you needed to deal with a whole lot of tariffs and non-tariff barriers. If you wanted to send money from one country to another, you had to deal with a very messy and complicated system of banks dealing with other banks across borders and difficulties of communication between them. And if you wanted to convey information, you could use the postage system, which was pretty cheap, or else you could make international phone calls or international data transfers, which were by today's by comparison with today, relatively expensive. So this was a world in which there certainly was stuff that happened between states, but the really important economic activity happened inside state borders rather than across them. Over the last 30 years, we have seen an utter transformation in this. We now live in a world where there are vast flows of goods and money and information across borders, and where people too can travel pretty straightforwardly. So if we look at the world trade economy, it has been utterly transformed. We now live in a world where there are relatively low tariff barriers, and this not only means that it is cheap to send manufactured products from one country to another, it also means that the entire manufacturing process has been disaggregated across countries so that these global supply chains effectively allow a subcontractor in one country to provide a component component for a finished product, another subcontractor in a different country to provide a different component, then assemblers to put these together, to send the sub-assemblies back and forth, until finally you get a developed product like an iPhone, which has inside it components which have been made by perhaps 40 or 50 or 60 suppliers or even more across a dozen different countries. And this is something which would have been simply unimaginable 40 or 50 years ago. We see similar things happening with regard to money transfers across borders. We see vast amounts of capital, trillions of dollars, sloshing around the world economy, looking for temporary arbitrage opportunities, looking for places where it can invest and earn reasonable profits. We see also information moving across borders. We see the creation of the internet, which is this vast distributed network which allows for information to travel in ways which again would have been unimaginable to somebody in the 1970s. And we also see movement of people across borders too. Here there are restrictions. It is hard for people to settle down permanently in other countries still. They also, depending on which country they come from, have to have visas and so on. But even so, there are still many, many more people traveling around the world than there used to be. It is relatively cheap and straightforward to get an airplane from New York and to land some hours later in Paris, in Stockholm, in London, in Dubai, in Shanghai, or in any one of a number of other different countries. So this is something which is fundamentally changed and fundamentally transformed. We live in a world of vastly increased flows thanks to globalization, and this turns out to have a variety of important consequences. Some of these consequences have to do with the spread of disease. Because if you think about how disease travels, if you think about how a contagion travels, a contagion typically travels across a social network of contact between human beings. So if, for example, you have a common cold and you possibly pass that on to other people, it will probably be people in your close family network, people who are at work, who share a common workplace with you, or people perhaps who you just pass by on the street and you sneeze at an inopportune time. So in other words, the way in which a cold virus travels is likely to reflect your travel patterns, and it is likely to reflect your social network. So this, of course, is not something that is new. This is something that has been true for a long time. But the ways in which these networks work and the ways in which these networks can carry infection have been transformed as a result of globalization. And the most useful way to think about this might be perhaps to look at a plague that happened several centuries ago, the so-called Black Plague or the Black Death. The Black Death began in Asia and moved through both Asia and Europe, killing huge numbers of people. In different parts of the world, it killed between 25% and 90% of the population, so that people, priests, thought that this was a visitation from God, that God was expressing his anger with the world and was effectively rubbing the human race out of existence. And if you were living back then in one of the devastated villages, you probably had pretty good reason to think that this was true. But even if this was an extraordinary and almost unimaginable catastrophe, it was also a slow-moving catastrophe. As Cosmas Shalitsi, who is a statistical physicist and network scientist, describes it, and I quote from him verbatim, one aspect to this is how slowly and how progressively the plague spread. It took decades to spread from Central Asia to the peripheral region of Western Europe, where it chewed steadily across the landscape. So it was an extraordinary, world-changing disease, but it took decades to get from one place to another. And this was a product of the social networks back then. Obviously, there was some trade, some interaction that happened across these communities, but it tended to be pretty sporadic, and it tended to be pretty slow. Now, if we live in a world where people move from country to country, where people can get planes and travel from the United States to China in a period of 15 to 16 hours, we find ourselves also in a world where contagions, which effectively hitchhike, they hop onto people's bodies, and they move through space along with those people, where contagions can travel much more rapidly too. You see this, of course, in the fictional movie Contagion, which depicts how this disease spreads rapidly across the world through coughs, sneezes, splutters, and airplanes. But you also see how this can happen through simulations, which provide you a sense of how it is that a contagion can move far, far more rapidly than it was ever possible to imagine back in the past. So, this is a model which was created by the Institute for Disease Modeling, and it gives you some sense of how it is that a contagion can travel in an exponential fashion. So I'm going to begin the simulation, and you'll see that it begins with numbers in the hundreds and the thousands. Then, as it spreads across the landscape, as more and more of the landscape is covered in red dots, it moves from the thousands into the hundreds of thousands, and then into the millions. So we see finally, as the red has covered much of the landscape, that it ends up in this simulation infecting just a shade under 33 million people who die as a result of this contagion. This is a model of a global flu pandemic which was created before the current coronavirus contagion, but which gives you an idea of how rapidly and how comprehensively a contagion can spread, and also how this is an exponential process. So roughly speaking, you could imagine that it begins with, say, one person who spreads it on to two other people, and those two other people, perhaps over a period of a few days, spread it to another two each, so that 4 people are now infected, and then 8, and then 16, and then 32, and then 64, and pretty soon you are moving to the thousands, the tens of thousands, and the hundreds of thousands and millions. Unfortunately, it is relatively difficult for human beings to think systematically about how exponential processes like this can take hold, which of course is one of the reasons why the reaction to coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, was perhaps slower and much more inefficient than it might have been in a better world. So, this tells us an important thing about globalization, which is that globalization results in interdependence. Interdependence is another long word which can be broken down pretty straightforwardly. More or less what interdependence means is that the more that there is contact or connection between, say, two different countries, we'll say country A and country B, the more that events that happen in country A may have consequences for country B and vice versa. So in other words, as we would expect that as globalization increases, as it creates more flows back and forth between countries, of people, of money and whatever, we would expect that interdependence is going to increase as well, so that what happens in one country is more likely to have consequences for another country. And this very obviously is true in the case of contagion. If there are two countries where there are a lot of ties of people going back and forth between them, and if a contagious disease develops in one country and manages to spread across it, this is almost certainly going to have consequences for the other country as well. The other country is going to find that it is going to have individuals coming in, passing on the contagion, and the epidemic is going to flow into its national territory too. So interdependence results in a lot of benefits sometimes, but it also results in a lot of problems. And the more interdependence there is between different countries, the more difficult it is to solve problems purely at the national level. And so this is one of the reasons why we have international institutions coming into being, because these international institutions allow for a lot more coordination to take place than might otherwise be possible. And here on the slide you see a reference to Gavi, which is an international organization that involves the World Health Organization, the World Bank and other institutions who are all working together in order to create vaccines for contagious diseases. And the logic of this is pretty straightforward. In an interdependent world, states have a strong incentive to cooperate and to collaborate together in order to solve problems like infectious contagions, because infectious contagions are a challenge to all of them and can spread rapidly in an interdependent world. Hence, they have an incentive to create global frameworks, global institutions which can help cooperation to take place, which can provide means through which states and individuals within those states and organizations and non-profit or bodies and so on, all of these can cooperate together. And so this is why we have what might be called a cooperative global health architecture. This involves organizations such as the WHO, the World Health Organization, which I just mentioned a moment ago, which plays a crucial role in providing information and coordination across the world. It shares information about diseases, about their progress. It collaborates with other actors in order to organize networks of experts to figure out how to respond to specific problems. When there is a crisis situation, it shares information among states, and it helps those states to coordinate with each other. And it also declares pandemics, which is supposed to be a tool that allows states to really realize that there is something crucial happening that they need to all band together collectively in order to fight. Now, of course, in real life, this doesn't work as nicely as it does in theory. The WHO, like other organizations, is plagued with politics, is plagued with bureaucratic inefficiencies, sometimes of one sort or another. But it does try to do its job. And without this kind of collaborative, cooperative health architecture, our life would be much more difficult when we wanted to fight against these collective problems. In addition to international organizations such as the WHO, one can also point to the work of a variety of other initiatives, non-profit initiatives such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which seek to work sometimes with the WHO, sometimes with other networks of actors, in order to try to fill in gaps, to do things that cannot readily be done by a big international organization which is subject to politics. And again, the basic intuition is pretty straightforward. The reason that these non-profit organizations get involved in this is because they perceive global health problems as being a problem for all of us, especially when it comes to contagious diseases. And obviously there also is a degree of humanitarianism in there as well. There is a recognition that even when contagious diseases or other things are not risks to countries that are doing reasonably well, that there are humanitarian reasons why you might want to help other human beings who otherwise might suffer from these miserable diseases. So this is why we have this cooperative global health architecture of However, there is another important aspect to international coordination on health issues, which by and large gets much less attention, even though it is crucially important. And that is the for-profit sector. So if we think about these various international collaborative arrangements, they do not themselves, by and large, produce the physical supplies that are necessary in order to fight contagion or to prevent it from occurring in the first place. Instead, they turn to the private sector to do this. So you can think about pharmaceutical companies which create new drugs, new vaccines. You can think about manufacturers who make medical masks, medical gloves, all of these things. You can think about engineering companies who create the respirators that we need. All of these are created by for-profit companies operating within the for-profit economy. And like other parts of the for-profit economy, they have by and large been subsumed into a global marketplace as a result of globalization. So we can think about how, in particular, they have been integrated into what might be described as global health supply chains. On the one hand, if you are looking to try and source some kind of medical supply, say for example medical gloves, you probably are not if you're, for example, you're a hospital in the United States, you are going to probably look to an importer, which is probably not going to look close at home. It may look to another country entirely across the world, such as China, such as Malaysia, in order to get whatever medical supply it is that you need. And so here you see in the slide, you see the representation of how agents for perhaps testing kits or something like that are manufactured. And you also see these big shipping containers, these big stackable boxes, which are what make it extraordinarily cheap to send things around the world in bulk. And as Danny Roderick said recently in a somewhat similar lecture to this, this is why these shipping containers have become a kind of visual metaphor for how globalization works, because they provide the backbone of the global supply chain system. Obviously, there are other things that you're going to send by air freight if they are more time sensitive or if they are more fragile, but nonetheless, these global supply chains play a crucial role in coordinating supply and demand, and without them, the whole system would not work. So, this is a system that, again, has been transformed by globalization, has been transformed by these global networks, have been transformed by the possibility of creating supply chains that go across borders. And this has resulted in a very, very high degree of efficiency. So it's possible to get many of these supplies far more cheaply from manufacturers in different parts of the world than might have been possible in a previous era. Perhaps in segments of the market which compete on quality, it might be possible to get higher quality goods too than otherwise might have been possible. But we are also finding how it is that the endless quest for efficiency on the part of business, on the part of hospitals or other end customers who are looking for the cheapest possible supplies that are at a requisite level of quality, how this results in some unexpected consequences. Roughly speaking, the more efficient these supply chains become, the more that they eliminate slack, the more that they eliminate inventory. There is a famous statement from Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, that inventory is evil, which has been taken to heart by many, many different firms and many, many different manufacturing sectors. The more that slack and inventory and other forms of redundancy are eliminated in the quest for efficiency and profits, the more likely it is that when the system comes under strain as a whole, perhaps because of an unexpected shock of demand, that it isn't going to perform particularly well. And this is more or less what we are finding out about in the current global pandemic situation, which is when you have this global system, which is all about efficiency, all about ruthless cost cutting, what happens when everybody suddenly wants the same medical supplies at once, so that demand increases dramatically, more or less overnight, but where there isn't enough slack in the system to meet all of the demand that is out there. So this effectively is the downside of this global health supply chain, which is the market form of coordination that supports and goes hand in hand together with the more touchy-feely forms of collaboration and cooperation that we think about in the global health architecture. So, as I say, all of this is resulting in an enormous shock. So we are seeing how this works out in the situation of an incredible shock, both to the traditional global health system and to global supply chains, which also play a crucial role in allowing us to fight against disease and contagion. And the coronavirus is, of course, the villain behind this shock. So, just to give you a few relevant facts, I am not a medical scientist, obviously, I'm a political scientist, so this is all gathered from standard sources. Human beings have lived with coronaviruses for a long time. And we suffered already from coronavirus-related illnesses, which typically were forms of the common cold. roughly a quarter of all instances of the cold, as best as we can tell, were caused by coronaviruses. But since the common cold is not that much of a big deal, there wasn't all that much research which went into the coronaviruses that we suffer from at the moment. However, it has become clear, and it became especially clear back in 2002, that there is another risk from coronaviruses, which is a risk from the coronaviruses that have not been circulating in the human population, but instead have been endemic in other animal species. Because when a virus jumps the species barrier, as coronavirus might well do, as different kinds of coronaviruses might well do, then this can have very, very serious health consequences. If the coronavirus is moderately good at infection, if it's able to infect other hosts relatively efficiently, it could spread very, very fast indeed, because it will be spreading in a population of human beings which have not had the opportunity to build up any resistance to it. Furthermore, it will be in a situation where the coronavirus and human beings haven't had a chance to get used to each other, and quite often when that is the case, when it is a virus which has not circulated in the species for a long time, the effects of that virus may be more dramatic and more severe. As I mentioned, we already had some kind of warning of this back in 2002. When a relative of the coronavirus that is now afflicting us, the coronavirus associated with SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, originated in China, spread through China, which, as with today's crisis, was initially quite unwilling to spread and to make information available, spread through China, was potentially a very, very severe risk, but eventually was more or less successfully stamped out with a brief recurrence back in 2004. This was a situation where there were approximately 8,000 reported cases of SARS and 774 people died. But the virus, even though it was worse for the people who caught it, it was less efficient at infecting human hosts, which made it easier to isolate and to get rid of pretty straightforwardly. Now, of course, we are dealing with a different coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, which also originated in China. It has a lower death rate than its cousin, but is also quite infectious and has very serious consequences for older people in particular. This virus began, as I say, in China, and we saw how it is that the Chinese state initially sought to pretend that nothing was happening. At the provincial level, doctors who started talking about this SARS-type illness spreading found themselves being relatively quickly silenced. We saw also some degree of censorship of discussion on the internet about what might be happening. Then, however, when the Chinese state realized that it couldn't ignore this anymore, it engaged in a quite massive effort to try to stop the coronavirus from spreading. So it locked down approximately 57 million people. They were locked into their houses. They were only able to go out every 2 or 3 days, one person to do shopping. Highways were closed. There was a massive all-society effort to make sure that this virus effectively was brought under control. As best as we can tell, although we cannot be 100% trusting of the statistics, it appears that this was a relatively effective set of measures within China, which you might think about as demonstrating both the weaknesses and the strengths of an authoritarian state when dealing with a problem like this. The weaknesses are initially that it is hard to get the information circulating or to get people to pay attention to the information. Very likely provincial officials didn't want to acknowledge the seriousness of the crisis because they feared that their jobs might be at stake if they did. But once the state has decided to do something about it, it can act in a very effective way, relatively hierarchically, in order to impose a relatively draconian regime which disciplines human beings, which prevents them from socializing with each other, and which can have relatively effective consequences relatively quickly. So, the problem, of course, was that coronavirus by the time that China had managed to bring it under some degree of control, had spread to the rest of the world. And there was some initial effort to try and prevent this. There was some effort to block people from traveling to and from China. There was some degree of monitoring in airports for people with unusually high temperatures, but the efforts were pretty sporadic and not especially effective, and not surprisingly, the contagion spread. It spread along the kinds of globalized networks of air travel that you might expect, which is to say that it spread initially within the region. We saw a lot of contagion happening in Japan and in South Korea. We probably have a lot of contagion as well in North Korea, but it's very, very hard to know exactly what is happening. And also, interestingly, there was a pretty severe crisis of coronavirus, which is still ongoing in Iran. And the reason for that is plausibly that Iran, although it is cut out of the global economy because of US sanctions, is closely connected with China, which buys its oil and provides it with some degree of economic linkages and ties which are desperately needed in the Iranian economy. So this, first of all, meant that it was likely that the virus might travel from China to Iran, and it also meant perhaps that Iran was reluctant to cut off links to China for fear that it might anger a country upon which it depended economically and to some degree politically. In addition to this, we saw the virus traveling to Western Europe, becoming especially well established in Italy, and becoming established in North America and the United States, where it clearly has been spreading in the community for quite a while, but we still, at the time that I give this lecture, we still don't have a very good idea of the numbers of infection because of various problems in testing, both because of a lackadaisical reaction by the by authorities and because of the fundamental shortages in tests that I will describe later, which are partly to do with problems within the US system, and also are partly to do with problems in getting access to various agents which are necessary to carry out the tests in question. China was the first hit by the coronavirus, which meant that it hit China especially hard, but also provided China with some advantages that other states which were hit later have not had. And these advantages stemmed from two things. First of all, it was an accident of timing. The fact that China was hit first meant that China was able to effectively look and figure out what supplies it needed before other states were ready to begin to start thinking and planning comprehensively for coronavirus. And second, because China is unusually well situated. China is a manufacturing hub for the world. If you look at global maps of supply chains, you will see that China plays an extraordinary central position in many of the crucial global manufacturing networks. So that, for example, it has factories which make masks, which make a variety of pharmaceuticals, and this meant that when China finally realized that it needed to respond to coronavirus, it was capable effectively of taking all of this production and telling the factories that your only customer from here on in is going to be the Chinese government, and also taking foreign companies such as 3M, which had a manufacturing plant in China, and telling them more or less the same thing. So China was able to take domestic production facilities, which were already producing many of the goods that were necessary to fight against the contagion, and was able to tell them, you are going to dedicate all of your output to us. It also was able to get other factories to begin to re-gear their production towards medical supplies that were urgently needed. And the final thing that it was able to do was to act on world markets. Because China, for example, produces roughly half of the world's supply of masks, but in addition to this, it was able to go to world markets and go to other major mask manufacturers and buy up all their production. So you see this here in this New York Times article, which describes how a factory in western France in the town of Angers typically makes about 170 million masks a year and found itself confronted with an order from China for 500 million masks, which required it to move to a breakneck schedule of running its machines 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in order to try to keep up with this massive new demand. So China was disadvantaged because it had to respond to the coronavirus before anybody else did, but it also had some advantages because it was, first of all, in domestic control of many of the manufacturers that it needed in order to provide it for supplies, and it was able to corner world markets for other medical suppliers in order to try and meet the challenge that it faced at scale. This has had consequences. It has had consequences for other countries which have found themselves trying to catch up later and have found that the supply chains on which they might have otherwise relied are not providing them with the goods that they need. Because the problem with global supply chains is that they were geared towards a specific level of market demand. And when demand skyrocketed, and it began to skyrocket with China, but began to grow bigger and bigger and bigger as other countries piled in, those other countries discovered that China had effectively already secured many of the key global supplies. And in addition, they suffered from a double whammy because other things that they might have wanted to have, certain pharmaceuticals, needed chemicals, needed primary products, which were produced by Chinese manufacturers, some of which were located in the lockdown zone. So we saw suddenly massive problems with global supply chains. And in particular global supply chains that involved products which had been bought up by China, or else products that had some crucial component that was produced within China. And states other than China were completely unprepared to deal with this. In principle, of course, these states could have built up extensive supplies, extensive stockpiles of emergency provisions for situations like this, but in practice they hadn't done this to nearly the extent that they needed to or should have, and when they did do this, very often they didn't bother to maintain the supplies, so that the supplies had expired by the time that they were called into play. And this is especially obvious in what happened in Italy. So Italy found itself in a very, very difficult position because a contagion which it had largely ignored in the early stages in the towns of northern Italy broke out and effectively paralyzed the Italian economy, Italian politics and Italian society, and large numbers of old people suddenly developed respiratory problems and had to go into hospital. And Italy found that it did not have enough medical masks to provide to its doctors, its nurses, its other hospital personnel. It didn't have medical gloves. It didn't have respirators in particular, which were needed to help people who were critically affected by the coronavirus, with the result that Italy and Italian doctors found themselves having to make quite horrific decisions about rationing, more or less deciding who would live, who would die, so that older people who, in the eyes of doctors, had a lower chance of survival, simply found themselves unable to get access to the respirators that might have given them some kind of a chance at life. So this revealed, in a sense, the fundamental weaknesses, the fundamental fragility of this global system of markets, this globalization, this system of international supply chains, because it turned out that these supply chains had all of these choke points and had all of these bottlenecks, which meant that some states found themselves simply incapable of getting the supplies that they needed in order to protect and provide help for their citizens who were afflicted with coronavirus. And obviously also this also was a situation where some states were going to be better off than others. If you were a state like China, which had either gotten its act together early, or else even better, had substantial manufacturing facilities that were already producing the goods in question under your control, you were in a relatively advantaged position. If, like Italy, you were a country which relied extensively on global markets and had some manufacturing capacities, but not nearly enough to meet demand, then you found yourself in a whole lot of trouble. The consequences of this for politics and for geopolitics have been striking. And you see this in particular happening within the European Union. So the European Union is supposed to be a union of states in Western and Central Europe, which are in principle supposed to have a high degree of solidarity with each other. The European Union is based around the notion of ever closer union, of harmony, and of bringing the states that constitute it closer together. But it turns out that in a world of global pandemic, that solidarity is rather weaker than one might have hoped for in the best of all possible worlds. So when Italy began to get hit by this crisis earlier than other states, it appealed to its European neighbours in order to get help, in order to get urgent medical supplies, and it found itself turned down. Worse than being turned down, other countries began to effectively try to make sure that whatever they had, they kept. So that Germany introduced restrictions that made it difficult for German companies to export masks or other critical medical equipment outside of Germany's borders. France took the simpler expedient of having the state effectively requisition all of the medical masks on its territory and say that they belong to the state so that they could then be devoted presumably to the benefit of French citizens rather than citizens elsewhere. And Italy found itself for a long period out of luck. This has changed a little bit in the recent past. There is a lot of talk now about the European Union trying to organize itself so that there is greater solidarity in the distribution of medical supplies, but there also is some skepticism as to how well the rhetoric is translating into reality. This also has had consequences in other countries, and in particular has led many politicians to start talking about how it is that one simply cannot rely upon the rest of the world to provide you with critical medical supplies in a situation of pandemic. And unsurprisingly, politicians who were already strongly inclined towards nationalism have seized upon this as a set of justifications for further restrictions to trade. So here, for example, you see in the United States, you see people like Peter Navarro, who is the Trump administration's trade advisor. You see Senator Tom Cotton of Alabama, both saying that the United States cannot rely upon other countries. In Navarro's description, there are no allies in a crisis such as coronavirus. And Cotton has called for the United States to change its global supply system, and effectively, rather than relying upon global supply chains, it should instead, according to Cotton, it should build up some kind of domestic supply capacity to make sure that it cannot be vulnerable to China in particular in the future. So roughly speaking, we're seeing two different kinds of things happening as a consequence. First of all, we're seeing some degree of traditional protectionism. Cotton and Navarro's proposals would imply probably that there would be, after the crisis, that there would be efforts to try and build up domestic US companies at the expense of foreign competitors, perhaps through some forms of imports or standards or other forms of restrictions. But you also see what might be described as reverse protectionism, where in the shorter term, states have sought to make sure that their supplies are devoted to their own citizens and to nobody else by imposing restrictions on exports rather than on imports. So this kind of reverse protectionism is having some important consequences and is also leading to an increase in distrust among states who are increasingly beginning to think about health in national security terms as being a field in which one cannot trust to other states, and instead one has to resort to self-help and to protecting one's own interests, even when this results in other states being potentially hurt. This is likely to have consequences for the global health architecture that I talked about earlier on. Already we are seeing that countries are very often ignoring the WHO outlines, the WHO recommendations. As the New York Times reports, dozens of countries are flouting international regulations and snubbing their obligations. They are failing to report outbreaks with the organization as they're required to do. Obviously, many of them are instituting international travel restrictions, even though the WHO has advised against this, and without notifying global health officials of what they are doing. So we are seeing, in a sense, a move away from a cooperative model of information sharing to one in which it is much, much harder for states to coordinate on how to fight this than it ought to be. And we saw this most recently in the G7 meeting, which ended without an agreed statement because effectively the United States, represented by Pompeo, wanted the statement to describe the virus as the Wuhan virus, suggesting that the origins in China were important, and so this obviously caused a certain degree of political friction. Now, this isn't just about talk and about rhetoric. It also possibly may turn out to have consequences for practical cooperation, even in areas that ought to be no-brainers for states to cooperate on, such as vaccine production. As we discussed earlier, vaccine production is one of those things which ought to be a win-win for states, in that if you produce a vaccine as a state, unless you restrict it, it should be possible for me as a state to benefit from it as well. And furthermore, you should have no reason to restrict it and prevent me from benefiting, because when I benefit, when my citizens become immune to a disease or become less likely to catch it, your citizens too will be benefited because there will be less chance of the contagion breaking out and perhaps spreading to them. So global vaccine production is one of those areas where you ought to expect that cooperation is almost baked into the nature of the benefits that are provided. Unfortunately, however, this is not the way in which the politics are playing out right at the moment. So back on March 17th, an article was published in a major German newspaper which talked about how there was a big fight potentially happening between the United States and Germany over a German company which was looking to make a vaccine. More or less what appears to have happened is that some kind of offer was made to the vaccine company during a meeting with the Trump administration in the White House. What the nature of that offer was is not entirely clear, but the result was that Germany believed that the United States effectively was looking to take control of this vaccine and to ensure that it would possibly be offered only exclusively to United States citizens. So this led to a lot of rhetoric and a lot of furore in Germany, and also led to a number of statements coming from senior German politicians, senior German ministers, which suggested that they viewed this as being a credible threat that the United States might do this. Now, as I say, it's not clear exactly what happened, but what is important here is that this kind of suspicion would have been more or less completely unimaginable a few months ago, and now it appears that states are fundamentally suspicious that other states might seize control of vaccine production and might use it purely and solely for their own citizens to the disadvantage of the citizens of other countries. This is not just between Germany and the United States. We saw, for example, also a statement made in a major newspaper in China, the Global Times, which is controlled effectively by the ruling Communist Party. We saw an article there which suggested that China too needed to think carefully about vaccines, that it could not trust that if the US or Europe developed a vaccine, that it would be shared with China. So here we see effectively how it is that an area of cooperation, which would seem to be a very obvious area in which there would be very, very little clash of interest is being transformed into a world, into an area where effectively states seem to be in contention with each other and fundamentally suspicious of each other. It is highly unlikely that this is going to result in any kind of generalized vaccine wars, but what is likely to happen is that this is going to hamper cooperation, hamper information sharing, and perhaps make it more difficult to get a vaccine ready, tested, and out to the world in the kind of time frame that we might like to see it made available in. If we put all of this together then, what do we get? Well, first of all, I think we see that supply chains, these global supply chains that we have put so much faith in, turn out to be far less reliable and far less robust than we imagined. So the standard visual metaphor, as you saw earlier, for the globalization of supply chains is these containers, these stackable containers, which suggest that you have this system in which things are more or less interchangeable, they are robust, they can be stacked on top of each other, they can be scaled up and down as necessary, and this in fact is not the world of supply chains that we live in. Instead, we live in a world of supply chains where efficiency has been prized over trying to make those supply chains robust against unexpected shocks. And the result is that in a period of crisis, we find that these supply chains, they are not like these stackable containers, but instead they are much more like that picture of the teetering pile of boxes, which can be pushed over by the slightest breath of wind going in the wrong direction. And this also, it turns out, has political consequences. So that in a world where supply chains are like this, in a world where health supply chains in particular cannot be relied upon, we are likely to see global health turn into a national security issue. Rather than being perceived as something which is a collective good, something which provides collective benefits to everybody, we are likely to find ourselves in a world where states look to the possibility of bottlenecks, look to the possibility of a breakdown of the supply chains, and then instead decide that they are going to make sure that they and their citizens are well off, regardless of what that means for other states. So that we find ourselves, in effect, in a kind of a beggar thy neighbor kind of world in which everybody plausibly ends up worse off. So at the moment, we apparently, as best as we can tell, there are roughly 50 countries that have introduced export restrictions of one sort or another on medical goods. And most recently, we see that India is looking to block the export of pharmaceuticals that it perceives as being necessary to its population, which has massive consequences for countries in both the developing and the developed world, because India is one of the major suppliers in the world of generic medications of one sort or another, which also play an important role in fighting against coronavirus. So this is a very, very different world. We see, furthermore, we see an increased emphasis on domestic control of the economy. In a world where supply chains become a security issue, we can expect that the state is going to take more and more of a role in trying to make sure that it can manage the risks that are associated with supply chains, and this is likely to lead to far greater state intervention in the economy and in trying to manage aspects of the economy than we have seen before. The previous pattern, which had been effectively to trust to markets to get everything right, is turning very quickly into a very different kind of world in which states are fundamentally suspicious of what might happen to them in a crisis situation, and they are likely to take steps. This also provides, obviously, opportunities for economic nationalists like Donald Trump and many people in his administration to try to pull back from the global trading system to some degree and to argue that we need to have domestically controlled supply chains within the United States, which is likely to lead not only to the kinds of reverse protectionism that we have talked about earlier, which in fact the United States is not really so far engaged in which we see restrictions on exports, but also more traditional forms of protectionism in which imports are restricted to, in order to make space for domestic companies which may not be as efficient, but which plausibly can offer better choices in the event of an emergency. One can imagine that this could have a whole lot of other repercussions, but also it should be noted that there is some debate and some dispute which suggests that it's not quite clear how far this is going to go. So that the Trump administration, for example, has been extremely reluctant up to this point to effectively use some of the powers that it has, which would allow it to demand that businesses start producing the medical supplies for the government that the government arguably needs. The US government has been relatively reluctant to do this, which suggests that there is a debate happening within the administration, in the United States at least, as to how far this should go, and that business interests still are able to, for the moment at least, preserve some degree of independence and autonomy. And the final interesting consequence that this may be having is that we may be seeing a move to a world in which we might see a different kind of politics playing out among those countries that are lucky enough to have some degree of surplus in these critical medical supplies. So that the Chinese government has been looking to engage in what Abe and I describe as competitive generosity. That is, it is providing masks, it is providing kits for testing, it is providing a number of other goods which are in short supply, and it is arguably doing this for two reasons. First of all, it wants to try and create a different narrative, both for domestic and for international consumption, from the narrative of China having more or less dropped the ball in the early stages of the coronavirus by failing to take account of what was happening and by trying to hush it up. This creates an attractive alternative narrative which China can then use in order to cover up some of the blunders that it made right at the beginning. But also, it is very plausible that China is also using this to try to, in effect, create some kind of a broader leadership role for itself and to undermine the leadership of the United States of America. The United States, under the current administration, has neither the resources nor the willingness to provide these kinds of global goods, to be generous and to really show that aspect of global leadership, which is an important part of global leadership, is the willingness to be generous in difficult times. And China, it would appear, is seizing upon this as an opportunity to try and take the United States' place. Now, how successful this is going to be, we simply don't know. It could be that this is a short-term phenomenon which blows over. It could be that this marks a significant change in the global economy. All of these are open questions which we simply don't have a very good idea of right as of this moment. We are, in a sense, we are looking at history as it is being made. We are looking at a quite important, and perhaps it may turn out even fundamental, transformation of the global economy and of the strategic politics of the global economy, and we're trying to make sense of it as it is all happening, and it's a pretty hard task to really understand what is going on. This is something where we can make our best guesses now, and we can figure out 6 months, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years from now whether we were right or whether we were wrong. But this is, it would appear, a very, very important moment in the world's politics and in the world's economy. And the one thing that we can say is that to understand what is happening, you need to understand all of these aspects of the international economy, which have appeared, frankly, to be too dull and too boring for political scientists to pay attention to in the past. Things such as supply chains, things such as logistics, all of these things turn out to have fundamental strategic consequences. We have taken them for granted, and now we are discovering that we cannot take them for granted at all in the future. So if you're, you can see here, this is a number of resources which we can provide to you. This is written work which provides you with some of the background to the slides which I presented today. We can see also there are some podcasts if you prefer to listen than to read. These also provide some sense of our broader ideas of weaponized interdependence. Thank you very much, all of you, for listening. Hope that this has been useful, and good luck to you all in these difficult and these difficult times where we really do not know what the future is ahead of us. We are trying to figure it out as we go along. Thank you all. Goodbye.